Hi everyone, James Lang here, UX Research Director at YouTube Creators. I'm joined for today's conversation by Dan Romlein. Dan is a UX designer on our team, and he's a particularly creative and thoughtful practitioner that I've really enjoyed talking to about his work and his career. In the conversation, we're going to cover a number of topics that I think are very relevant to people starting out, but also to seasoned UX practitioners. The role of creativity, the role of being true to oneself, imposter syndrome, authenticity, and navigating a path through a UX career. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, Dan, thank you for joining today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the world of UX and creativity from your point of view. And I wondered if we could just start by you telling the folks viewing a little bit about the journey that you've taken to get to working at YouTube in the role that you do now.
Absolutely. So I came to UX through the art world. I went to college and studied art, took a couple design classes and found that really interesting. And until that point, I'd kind of always been into making things, drawing, creating, but I hadn't quite figured out how that was going to translate into a career and a way to make money. And then I found design, and that seemed like a natural connection, a natural point to develop that further. So out of school, it was a liberal arts education with a concentration in design. And so I had a little bit of a existential inferiority complex that I hadn't really gone to design school. I hadn't gone through what I thought was needed in terms of getting into a real design job. But I started out slowly, and I kind of did a internship initially that was really generous in giving me on-the-job training and putting me through kind of self-directed online learning. And so I got to develop a lot of the skills of design that I hadn't been able to do in college and university. And from there, sort of progressively found myself in more technical roles. So initially it was graphic design, web design, doing some branding, and then getting a little bit more into the website experience, kind of user experience. And that gave me, I think, just enough credentials to really call myself a user experience designer, a UX designer, and get my first official UX job at a startup. That startup integrated with a Google open source technology for cloud. And so I kind of got lucky. I was one of very few UX designers in the world who knew anything about this very technical, developer-focused technology, Kubernetes. And if not for kind of being forced to at this company, I would not have learned anything about it, wouldn't have really found it that engaging or interesting, but kind of being thrust into that world. Then I was doing things in the open source, and because it's a Google open source project, found myself connected to other UXers at Google. And that was my foot in the door for my first job at Google, which was working on cloud back in 2017, and did that for a few years and then joined YouTube in 2020.
The way that you described it, I think, is really interesting, Dan. It sounded like, as a creative person from the get-go, you saw design as a way of being able to make a career out of being creative in an intentional way. But then a lot of the steps along the way that you described sounded like almost slightly accidental or
Totally.
So I wonder if you can tell me a bit more about the combination of the intentional journey you took and kind of the way in which kind of things went the right way at key moments.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think I've always, especially circa the college years, had put a lot of pressure on myself to do the right thing and to Like I remember agonizing about which I wanted to study abroad, which study abroad program should I go with, and I don't want to mess this up. Kind of agonizing over the first job and comparing trade-offs in the learning opportunities with the amount they were willing to pay me as someone who didn't really have a lot of experience. And looking back at it now, I wish I'd been a little more easygoing and laid back about it, because I think the way it's really worked for me is just opportunities come up and arise, and things that I could have never have planned for, like the Kubernetes connection to Google. Like, I don't see how I could have ever mapped that out and sort of executed that as a plan. But being open and receptive to something new that comes along, like Kubernetes is not sexy to a designer. There's not much going on there visually, but I think that was the reason there was such a need for UX thinking to be in that space and be thinking about usability and empathizing with user journeys and kind of some of these concepts that weren't as much a focus at that time. So I'd say that's been largely the theme, has been trying to be prepared and open to what comes along. But at any point in that, I didn't really have a clear 5-year plan or a picture of the perfect company that I wanted to work at. It's just been a lot of being open and being receptive to what comes along.
I love that. And I wonder if this is a contrast with some other industries, like if you had started a career in law or banking or something like this, where there's much more of a defined path through it. Whether the expectation is that you do have more of a year-by-year plan. And just speaking for myself as somebody who's experienced imposter syndrome multiple times in multiple settings in my career, engaging with the idea that some things are accidental, I'm sure is partly where that comes from.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I felt like I should have more of a plan when I first came out of school. That seemed sort of like the hustle mentality that you kind of had to map out this structure. And since then and to this day, still really struggle with feeling, like an imposter sometimes. I just call it imposterism. I think it's the human condition, and I think it's something we all have to kind of grapple with and find a way to make peace with. It's just kind of something that you're going to experience, everyone to varying degrees, in getting comfortable with that feeling and being willing to acknowledge it and kind of come back to just the task at hand and the people you're able to leverage around you to lean on and to go to for help when you need it. And so, that's a continual learning journey for me.
I think just knowing that it's not something that one experiences alone is very helpful. And as you know, I've worked with more people in UX, I've come to realize it's almost universal as an experience at some point or another. And it's almost just an emergent quality of working in a field which doesn't have clear pathways, where we do tend to put ourselves in situations that are challenging and new and satisfy our curiosity. And I think, that's kind of the price of entry almost, but we should be kind to ourselves about it as well. I want to come back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, because you mentioned that you didn't really have a plan, but you did have this sense of yourself as being a creative person and wanting that to play a role in whatever work you did. And I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about how you've steered your career, not by a roadmap, but by a value, or by a sense of yourself, because that, I think, is something that a lot of people can probably identify with.
So kind of rewinding even, back to childhood, art and making things and expressing myself through art was always very much intuitive and ingrained into who I was in terms of interacting with the world, in terms of how I learned and how I remembered things and how I understood concepts. I was homeschooled, as I mentioned to you, so birth to 18 was all education at home, with some kind of supplementary programs that we incorporated. But what that enabled for me was art and a couple of other areas that were really interesting to me. But art, I could just kind of do and experience and play with and be experimental and not have a lot of the constraints of the structure of having to be in a particular class at a particular point in the day. And so, yeah, that was just very much interwoven into my whole educational and childhood experience. It was all very integrated, I guess. I have a complex relationship with art, where from an early age, I would get praised for the stuff I was making. And it was like, wow, you're so talented. That would be something I would commonly hear. And I think I internalized that as, I better not mess this up. Like, I've got a good thing going here. I better, kind of, I have expectations now that I am a talented artist or a talented creative. And so I think I'm still trying to get back to the purity of making art that I had as a kid. I think it's kind of been polluted, sounds a little dramatic, but gotten more complicated in some ways, thinking about expectations, even just expectations for myself about the kind of work that I create, the caliber of work that I hold myself to. So that's all kind of to say that it's been a complicated journey, but that aspect of creativity and authentically expressing myself was something that I knew I wanted to be a part of my career, whatever that was. I'd considered landscape architecture was my original plan, early days of college, because I love living things and working with plants. And so knew that I wanted to, I like framing it as a value. I wanted to incorporate that value into whatever I did professionally. And for a long time was unsure on how much passion should be a part of my work. And I think that contributed to the pressure initially. It was feeling like I had to love what I did, and I didn't want to mess up the path that I started down, getting on the wrong track, kind of. But where I've ended up, and I really appreciate UX for that, is that my day job is not the culmination of my artistic expression and creativity. It's great. There's a lot of creative things that I get to do, and I get to work that muscle and feel appreciated for things that I do creatively. But it's also, it leaves space and energy for doing a watercolor painting on the weekend or doing photography for some family event or something, and not feeling taxed by, or feeling a tension between kind of my work, creativity, and these other aspects of creativity that I like to explore.
I think you've touched on something that's really been on my mind when I was looking forward to this conversation, which is any advice you've got for folks who are maybe at the beginning of their career as a creative person entering this industry, to try and find that right balance between the work they're going to do, the work they're going to get paid for, and their desire to be and to practice as a creative person.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like you've been working through that for a few years now. What can you tell people at the beginning of that journey?
I think the most important thing is to keep keep the spark alive of your authentic creativity and not, I don't know, sell out or let yourself end up in a spot where you're just kind of trudging along or don't really feel creatively fulfilled, but are feeling drained by that. And so you don't have the energy to do things that are creatively fulfilling for you. And it's just kind of this vicious cycle. Because I think for creative people, that's a really powerful source of contribution that they can bring to someplace like YouTube or Google, is aspects of yourself that there aren't really a script for. And I think that's what Google is really good at hiring for, is people who are different and people who have interesting lives that are doing interesting things unrelated or very related to what their day job is. And so for me, I've kind of stumbled into some various areas. I know this is something that we wanted to touch on, but like doing sketch notes at various events and talks. And what I mean by that is just doodling, essentially, capturing my thoughts on paper or iPad or whatever it happens to be. And that started at Google as very organic. I wasn't doing it for other people or for any higher purpose than just kind of my own entertainment, really. It was like a way to stay engaged in meetings, and as a side benefit, it also helped me kind of remember some of the concepts that were being expressed. But as people saw those and I started to kind of share them around, I really found that there was an appetite for this sort of artifact, this thing that I'd made, and people were really excited about them and loved them. And it's now turned into something just really cool and fulfilling that I can have as something that I get to share with the team. So at our monthly team events, I'll usually do a recap visually and then share that out with people. And it's me getting to have a high degree of freedom and choosing what gets expressed and what gets put down. But it's also pretty low stakes. It's not like there's nothing riding on it. It's like just a separate thing to do for fun. And so that, as an example, I see as a great way to keep that I've, again, just kind of stumbled into, not a whole lot of intentionality there, but gotten to incorporate some of creativity that wasn't in my job description, but now is sort of something that I get to play with at work.
Right, and that you're well known for as well. I think it's a big part of your personal brand here as well. And you raise a great point, because we're both surrounded by talented musicians and writers and visual artists. There's so many talented people who work on this team, whatever their job title might be. Yeah. I think you're unusual in the degree to which your creative practice is like front and center in what you do here as well. You described it as low stakes, but I don't think it's low stakes in the sense that for our team culturally, it's something that's a real signature. It's a real, like a strong manifestation of the culture of our team. So I would never want to underplay how valuable I find it. I suppose my final question to you just is again about looking back over that journey. We talked at the beginning about how your values led you even if there wasn't a roadmap. Yeah. Knowing what you know now, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of getting to a place where you have as much integration as possible between your creative practice and the work you do as a designer?
I would have been much more self-compassionate and much easier on myself. As I mentioned a few times, I think really kind of, I don't know if it's just my chemical wiring or whatever, but I internalized this idea that being hard on myself was the way to get results, and kind of being relentless when it came to failure and getting back from failure. And that's still something I'm wrestling with, but I'm realizing just how much more enjoyable life gets when you're kinder on yourself. And I also think it opens up so many more possibilities. And there was a good talk, a talks at Google actually, on self-compassion that I was listening to. And one of the things she pointed out was that if you are self-compassionate, it opens up, you can learn from failure rather than treating it like the end of the world and you've got to kind of move on and whip yourself into shape and get back nose to the grindstone. You can be more curious around, why did things play out the way that they played out, and what might I do differently next time? How might I kind of treat the situation differently to get to a different result? And so that's an ongoing work for me. But yeah, I think it's just, life is great, and to be able to get to work in a creative field is such a gift, and I don't think it's worth stressing over or beating yourself up about failings or shortcomings. And certainly for myself, I would want to just and aspire to release a lot of that and take an easier, lighter approach to things.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your story. I think for people who are starting out in their career, or who are senior practiced veterans of UX, I think there will be a lot to identify with and a lot that resonated. I know there was for me. So thank you, and enjoy the next episode.